Welcome everyone. This is the Regulatory Compliance Associates webinar on combination products. Today we'll be talking about accelerating new product development and reducing risk and working through regulatory submissions. I'd like to introduce you to our panelists today. Joining us from Regulatory Compliance Associates, or RCA, is Dr. Steve Coulter. He's the General Manager at RCA on the West Coast office, and also Lisa Michaels, who is our attorney and general counsel and serves as a regulatory affairs expert also at RCA. These two speakers bring to you not just decades of experience in life science in these functional areas, but a deep well of experience in working in combination products. Then lastly, myself, my name is Deb Kurtz. I too am a consultant. I work on the commercial side of medical device, and I'm also RCA's marketing manager. Now that we know who we're talking to, let's talk about what we're going to accomplish today. And as you remember when you probably signed up to the webinar, this is what we're going to talk about, essentially accelerating product development timeframes while reducing our risk profile. So with that being said, I'd like to turn the webinar over to Dr. Steve Coulter. Take it away, Steve.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Glad you could join us today. Let's jump in and set some direction in terms of what we're going to discuss in the roles of product development and regulatory affairs. Product development, I think we're all fairly comfortable with. You know, we're chartered to do the right thing and to do it right. But what's another really important role of product development? That's to support the product through its entire life cycle and through the interfaces with all the cross-functional team members. It's all the other cross-functional team members, the manufacturing, the quality, the regulatory group that have to function together. So one of the key roles to product development, facilitating and reducing risk and shortening timelines, is to anticipate and work with those groups in support of them. In combination products especially, regulatory affairs is probably the most complicated aspect of this product area. You're having to dance between two sets of rules, perhaps three sets of rules in terms of what's required, how to submit, where to submit it, all sorts of questions. So the regulatory affairs area and the regulatory strategy is probably the most complex aspect of combination product commercialization. So we're going to focus today on discussing that and how can we reduce risk, facilitate the process, and what is R&D's role, product development's role in supporting regulatory strategies. Lisa, can you take it from there?
Certainly. Thanks, Steve. FDA's oversight of combination products is facilitated by the Office of Combination Products, which is also known as the OCP. The OCP was established by the FDA in 2002 pursuant to the Medical Device User Fee and Modernization Act. So the OCP itself does not review the marketing applications submitted for a combination product. Instead, they're responsible for assigning a lead agency center who's going to have primary jurisdiction for the review and the regulation of the combination product. And this is based on the primary mode of action of the product. The OCP is also responsible for the coordination of the collaborative or consultative reviews that involve more than one agency. And they are also responsible for resolving any disputes that may arise during the pre-market review of the marketing application. So the Office of Combination Products is going to assign the combination product to one of three agency centers, either CBER, CDER, or CDRH. And that lead agency center that's assigned by the OCP will have the primary responsibility for the review and regulation of the combination product, but they often consult or collaborate with the other branches. And in the past, the multi-agency center involvement often led to inconsistencies in interpretation and the feedback that was received between the various agencies. So to avoid having these inconsistencies and to better ensure a more streamlined process, the FDA created a standard operating procedure that is mandated for FDA staff to use during this inter-center consultative and collaborative review process. What we're going to talk about today is about the importance of facilitating very early and frequent interactions with the FDA regarding your product and preparing a robust regulatory strategy for your combination product that will hopefully ensure a more smoother pathway and ultimately the launch of your product. Due to the regulatory challenges of a combination product submission itself, early strategic regulatory planning is going to be necessary to ensure that your company fully understands and are properly prepared for all of the regulatory complexities that you may face as you proceed down the various regulatory pathways. There are 8 steps that we recommend for a successful launch of your product. And we're going to walk through each of these in great detail. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Steve Coulter to discuss the first step of this 8-step regulatory planning process, which is defining the combination product.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Step 1, let's start out by defining what a combination product is. The CFRs, parts 3 and 4, define combination products and how to handle them. But in very simple terms, combination products are a combination of 2 or more dissimilar constituent parts. So drugs, devices, biologics, as the different classes of those, it's dissimilar. They could be co-packaged, they could be co-labeled, but so long as they contain dissimilar constituents, we would have to be looking at these as a potential combination product. Let's start with the devices, medical devices. A device is defined as something that interacts with the body, whether it's for diagnosis, for treatment, for cures. But the one thing is it's almost an inverse definition. It acts like a drug, except that it's not a drug. It does not perform its action on the body either through a chemical action or through metabolism. So it performs the functionalities, but it is not part of metabolism. Whereas if we look at the definition of drugs, they do have the same definitions in terms of they work to diagnose, to treat, to cure, whatever, but their primary mode of action to elicit that effect is to either have some kind of chemical interaction or metabolism to affect that the effect on the body. Now, biologics are a unique group. They're a little bit more complicated than the drugs, and to separate the two, drugs, pharmaceuticals, whatever you may call it, are generally perceived as being synthesized, artificially created species, whereas biologics are derived materials from natural products. And in this case, when we're talking about natural products, we're talking about bloodstream, sera, blood components. It could be even proteins and cell bodies. But the biologics are coming from human sera, etc., and so they bring with them certain other safety issues because of infectious materials. So that's why biologics are a little bit more tricky than straight pharmaceuticals. So combination products, as we've discussed, are a combination of dissimilars. They can be 2 or more. They can be 2 drugs put together and put into a syringe or into a controlled delivery device. That would constitute a device and 2 drugs. If it's just the 2 drugs together, that's not a combination product because they're both in the pharmaceutical realm. It has to be dissimilar materials. Now, if we have these dissimilar materials, how do we decide what the lead agency is going to be? The lead agency talks about, is determined by the OCP talking about this primary mode of action. What is the main benefit that is delivered to the patient, to the customer, and how is it derived? Is it derived by the action of the device, for example, or the biologic product, for example? And so they will pick the lead agency based upon what has the greatest effect on providing the benefit to the patient. If it's a toss-up, if it's kind of too close to call to determine that, the OCP has a number of other considerations, and they'll use their algorithms to say, what about already existing products on the market, whether they're products, individual, combination products, or constituent parts. If they're already on the market, how were they handled in the past? What is the main area of risk? If two aspects, two constituent parts are similar in terms of familiarity, but one has higher risk, they will tend to favor that lead agency because they're more mature in handling those types of risks, so they'll do it that way. So there are other algorithms. Could be recent decisions that they've made, so they just want to be consistent now. So the OCP does have its methods for determining what the primary mode of action, who the lead agency would be. Lisa, would you like to get into the regulatory strategy?
Yes, thank you, Steve. So we're not going to talk about step 2 in this 8-step regulatory planning process. That's the development of the preliminary regulatory strategy. So you may ask, what exactly is the preliminary regulatory strategy? It's essentially the foundational cornerstone for establishing a smooth regulatory pathway for your combination product and its constituent parts. This is a controlled document. It's a strategic regulatory planning document that is intended to identify all of the applicable regulatory requirements for your product. It can be used for a new product, or it can be used for a modification to an existing product, but the fundamental point is that this regulatory strategy document can be used for any type of medical product. And when you want to first initiate this preliminary regulatory strategy is as early as possible, because along the line, things are going to change over time. So you really want to identify what the requirements are going to be at a very early phase so that you can plan accordingly throughout this long lead time. So when we look at combination products, each combination product really has to be looked at individually. They're each very unique products. They can range from very simple products to extremely complex. You might have a single entity product such as a pre-filled syringe, or you could have a co-packaged product like a surgical kit. In some cases, you're going to have more complicated products that are cross-labeled. Perhaps you have two different manufacturers of separately distributed products that are labeled for use with one another. So the regulatory submission for a combination product, as you can imagine, is extremely challenging because you're combining two or more parts of the different medical products that make up the combination product, known as the constituent parts, and each have their own regulatory requirements. Now, from a legal standpoint, the constituent parts actually retain their own regulatory identities. But when we're talking about a combination product is a distinct product that is not either a standalone drug, device, or biologic. So you really need to be aware that there are different regulatory requirements for each of these different types of medical products, and there's different regulatory pathways for each constituent part or the combination product as a whole. So your preliminary regulatory strategy has to be commensurate with the complexity of your combination product and the constituent part. So let's now talk about what are the critical elements that you need to include in your preliminary regulatory strategy. The first bit of information that's going to be critical is to clearly define what the combination product is and its constituent parts. Because drugs, devices, and biologics each have different regulatory pathways, and there's different marketing applications that are going to be applicable for each. So for devices, we're looking at either a 510K or a PMA. For a new drug, for a drug application, it's a new drug application NDA. And for a biologic, we're talking about a biologics license application. And each are complicated in their own right. So you also want to think about, in some cases, you may have a combination product that has a constituent part which is already cleared, approved, or licensed. So you want to identify those constituent parts that are, and you want to clearly outline all of the supporting documentation and data that you may already have for that constituent part, because you may be able to leverage it in the submission for the combination product. You should also define all of the possible modes of action of the product and establish what you believe is the most likely primary mode of action, since this will ultimately drive the type of marketing application that you're going to have to submit. It's very important at this early stage that you want to define your proposed intended use, indications for use. You want to think about all of the risks and benefits associated with the product. You also want to think about the types of claims that you want to make and your labeling. You should, at a very high level, think about the specific testing or clinical data that you're going to need to include in the marketing application or marketing applications to support submission and ultimately to substantiate the safety and effectiveness of the product. Your regulatory strategy also needs to address other key factors, such as your quality system requirements and other compliance-related requirements. Resources, timelines, costs, all of these factors need to be captured in your preliminary regulatory strategy. And there are also legal considerations that you need to account for. So let's say, for example, you're co-developing a product with another company. It's imperative that you are able to address these legal requirements that may be associated with, let's say, a joint venture or a similar type of arrangement. So to protect the legal interests of both parties, you may need to have agreements in place. You may need to have contractual agreements set forth, and those contracts can take some time to actually get executed. So you want to make sure that you think about all of these things very early on. In terms of the time frames to obtain clearance, approval, or licensure of your product, you also want to document the expectations for this, because oftentimes companies will not fully understand the actual lead time that's associated not only with developing the product, but preparing the marketing application, and then there's the extensive review time for the various types of marketing applications that may be necessary. So remember that the preliminary regulatory strategy is a living document, and this is a document that's going to be updated at regular intervals as you gather more information, data, if things change along the way. So you really want to make sure that you're looking at this on a regular basis and updating it as frequently as you can. Steve, I know you have some valuable insight on other aspects of planning. Why don't you take that away?
Thank you. It's important to realize that not all clients understand what planning is in the same vein. So we need to take a look at what we mean by planning. Each one of the cross-functional team members on a commercialization team need to have their own plans. So there's the regulatory plan, there's the quality plan, there's the manufacturing plan, risk management plans. Every one of these needs to have their own plan. It's not simply, a plan is not simply a Microsoft project timeline and Gantt chart. The plans are the strategy for how you're going to move forward, how you interface with the other groups, what are your inputs, outputs, what do you need to do your job, and then what are you delivering to whom? These are all parts of the plan. So the plan is much more dynamic than simply a number of due dates. And then a key also is, as Lisa said, they're living documents. You don't write a plan and put it on the shelf and open it back up when you close the project. They should be addressed regularly, because as the project evolves, things get better or worse than the original plan, you need to adjust for that. So they're living documents. Another key to writing a good plan is clarity and simplification. So if we take a look at the waterfall diagram that's used in the CFRs, the thing that I love about this, and I use this as an example to help people understand how to prepare their plans, it's simple, it's concise. I may know the aspects of my plan, but I know my functional area really well. But what about the other groups? I don't know theirs as well. They may not be as clear to me. So anything I can do in writing my plan to simplify it for other people to understand is critical to have an effective plan. The whole idea of the planning phase is to get everybody moving together in lockstep so we don't trip over each other somewhere during the middle or at the end. Let's move on to step 3 now.
So at step 3, we want to initiate some early feedback from the FDA. And the best method of doing this is to submit a pre-request for designation. The purpose of submitting a pre-request for designation is to obtain, as early as possible, feedback from the Office of Combination Products as to the identity or classification of your product as a drug, a device, biologic, or as a combination product, and which agency center is most likely going to be responsible for having primary jurisdiction for the review of your marketing application. So what the pre-RFD actually is a written submission that you would send to the Office of Combination Products that essentially describes what your product is, what it does, how it works, how you intend to market the product, what your proposed intended use, indications for use are, all known methods of action, and all of the components or ingredients, and any supporting documentation, testing, studies, anything that you may have at this early stage to support your product. Although this feedback is informal and it's non-binding, it's extremely beneficial to solicit this information early on in your product development process because this feedback may actually confirm or change the scope or direction of your project. So it's very valuable to take this preliminary step to get this informal feedback. So now let's talk about step 4, which is updating and revising the regulatory strategy. We're going to take the information that we receive, the informal, non-binding information from the FDA, and we're going to go back and update the regulatory strategy. We now have a better idea of what the classification of the product will be and the most likely agency center that's going to be responsible for it. So we want to confirm what the regulatory requirements are going to be for those various types of marketing applications that may be necessary. And we want to confirm whether or not we were on the right track in defining the type of testing, clinical data, supporting documentation, all of the different requirements that may be necessary for your individual type of product. And at this point, we should be able to strongly confirm the intended use, the indications for use, and we also want to address any technical or scientific issues that may have arose since the inception of when we first put together the preliminary regulatory strategy. Perhaps throughout this time frame, you've had some unexpected test results or data that is not favorable. You want to be able to address those issues and perhaps implement a new plan of action in order to remediate and resolve some of those problems that may have occurred over time. So the other thing that you'll want to think about again throughout this whole process is we're not only looking at the constituent parts, but we're always looking at the constituent parts and the combination product as a whole and how they interact and work together. So this living document, this regulatory strategy, to update it as you get more information, as you progress down your pathway, you're going to need to update it appropriately and to be prepared that things may not always run as smoothly as you anticipate. as we talked about earlier, there could be multiple types of marketing applications that may be required for your product. Again, this will be primarily based on the primary mode of action, but you need to be aware and consider all of the different requirements for each type of marketing application, the costs associated with each, and the extensive timelines in some cases for some of these products. So let's move on now to the next step that we recommend in this 8-step regulatory planning process, and this is the formal request for designation. This is very similar to the pre-RFP that we talked about, but this is actually going to provide formal binding feedback from the FDA. So a formal request for designation is also known as an applicant's letter of request. So it's a written submission to the Office of Combination Products, and the purpose is to solicit information about what the final determination will be as to the classification of your product and the lead agency center that's going to be assigned. It's a little more comprehensive than the pre-RFP, yet you have to be somewhat restricted in terms of the length of the information that you're going to send. So you want to be as concise as possible, but you do have a limitation in terms of the number of pages that you can submit for this submission. Once it's submitted, the FDA will take about 60 days to review the submission, and then they will issue their designation letter, which will be the final binding feedback as to what the final classification of your product will be, and then who will be responsible for the review of the marketing application that you're going to need to submit. So this binding feedback is critical, because now you can take this information and go back and update your regulatory strategy and come out with a final regulatory strategy. And that's the next step that we're going to talk about, but the finalization of the regulatory strategy. So at this point, we've been through several iterative steps of preparing the preliminary regulatory strategy. We've solicited informal and formal feedback from the FDA, and we've revised the regulatory strategy accordingly up to this point. So the final regulatory strategy needs to incorporate all the feedback that we've received to date from the FDA. It needs to address any changes or modifications that have been made to the product since we first put the preliminary regulatory strategy in place. And we need to, again, look back at any risks, any problems, any unfavorable testing, anything that has occurred along the way that could change the scope of your regulatory pathway. And again, this final regulatory strategy is primarily going to be based on the determination from your request for designation, because again, this will be the binding feedback that will really help put you on the appropriate regulatory pathway. Again, at this point, we're going to know whether or not a single or whether multiple marketing applications are going to be required. So in certain circumstances, multiple marketing applications may be necessary, but for the most part, a single marketing application is going to be appropriate. In some cases, it is really the only possible route to take due to the product being a single entity or it's co-packaged, or if you were to submit multiple applications, it would result in regulatory inconsistency. So at this point in the final regulatory strategy, you're confirming what it's actually going to take in terms of the regulatory submission, and you're also able to determine the costs associated with whether or not it's going to be a single marketing application or multiple. And these costs can be extremely expensive. So you need to make sure that your company is aware of all of the risks and all of the costs and resources that may be required to fully execute to this plan. So now we're at the stage where we have another opportunity to interface with the FDA. And I can't stress enough how important it is to have these early, ongoing, and frequent interactions with the FDA because it will ensure a smooth pathway for your regulatory product. We've discussed how valuable the informal and formal feedback is using the venue of the pre-RFD and the formal RFD, but this is yet another opportunity to talk to the FDA about what you plan to include in your marketing application or applications. So the process for doing this is to submit a pre-submission or pre-sub package to the FDA, which basically includes some of the same information that you've already submitted in the pre-RFD and in the formal RFD. It's an explanation of your product, what it does, all of the testing that you plan to include, the clinical data, all of the specific regulatory details based on the designation that you received during the formal RFD. And you want to be able to talk about any issues that the FDA may have regarding your product. Perhaps they have additional questions that can be addressed prior to you actually submitting your marketing application, or if there are concerns that the FDA may have about your product, you are able to hopefully resolve some of those issues before you actually submit them, so you don't get a deficiency letter going into your submission without being fully prepared for what some of those risks regarding your submission may be. Not only do these collaborative meetings benefit you as the sponsor, but they also benefit the FDA, because the FDA is now able to get a better idea of what they should expect when they receive your marketing application. So I think the most important thing about these early collaboration meetings is that it allows you to build a rapport with the FDA, and that is fundamentally probably the best advice that I can provide in terms of interfacing with the FDA, whether it is for a combination product or any other type of individual product. You want to build a very strong rapport with the FDA. You want to be transparent, open, and candid about your product. Share as much information as you're comfortable doing, because in the long run, that's ultimately going to propel you to getting your product in the marketplace faster than if you don't have those early interactions. Steve, I know you have a few examples that you'd like to share regarding how beneficial some of these early collaborations have been with some of your clients. Would you like to talk about those?
Yes, thank you, Lisa. We have a very recent client that ran into a very interesting meeting with the FDA, like this one of these pre-meetings. They had a technology platform, so it's going to be the same platform for each of 3 different products that they were going to take in. And they thought they'd walk on in, show the platform, and it was very logical. The platform should dominate, and then here are 3 other constituents that we're going to put in 3 different constituents, so they'll all be bundled together. And quite the contrary, the OCP took a look at this, and after discussions said, you know what, it's interesting, but 2 of these are much more like devices. And yes, your technology is the newest and the most novel aspect of this, so we're going to drive this to the device side. But then, having looked at the 3rd application, they said, but here you have a drug, and the drug is unique enough that we're going to keep this under the risks and the controls of the pharma side. So they actually, instead of having all 3 follow one pathway, which they had hoped to do, they ended up with 2 in the device pathway and 1 in the pharmaceutical. So that was, hugely useful to a small startup, because they could have been going down the wrong path, and they don't have the time or the dollars to go back and repeat things very often. So it was very, very helpful for them. Let's get on to step 8 on submitting the marketing application. So There are different components in those, the device, the drug, the biologics. So let's start in the device submission. Whether we're looking at cross-labeled, so they're labeled to be with each other, or co-packed each single entity, these are fairly easy to understand in that you have to have all of the specified requirements in the CFRs in there. The problem is when you're taking a look at, when you're taking a look at trying to combine all of these submission requirements, it can get really complex. How do I take a look at the controls that the device people usually put in place versus the controls that the biologics people put into place? Well, the FDA also called out in section 4.4 of the CFRs that largely these materials overlap. So if I take a look at the CGMPs, the designation for the quality systems in pharma and biologics, and the QSRs for the devices, about 85% of this stuff overlaps. And so they said you don't have to repeat the common work. Just take a look at what's unique. So if I'm coming from the drug side, if I'm used to operating under parts 210 and parts 211, then there are simply a half a dozen aspects here that I'm not used to addressing that have to be addressed from a medical device world. And if on the flip side, I take a look at the devices, the QSRs, so I'm used to approaching my submissions from the Part 820 approach. There are 7 or 8 things here that I'm not used to supplying, so I'm not going to have to address these during my development and testing phases to be ready for the submissions. Now, there's only one caution that we want to provide to you on this. In talking about the streamline, all of a sudden it starts sounding very simple. It's really easy then. I'm going to do one collected bucket and then 5, 6, 7 things on the side. In theory, that's all you're doing, but the devil's in the details, so you really need to focus on all of the requirements in these submissions. Lisa, can you help us out a little bit more there?
Sure, Steve. So at a very high level, we're just going to walk through each of these different types of marketing applications that will be relevant for your combination product or the constituent parts. And we're going to start off with the 510K for a device, and this is probably the most straightforward regulatory submission of the 4 that we're going to discuss today. A 510K is typically for a medium risk device. This is typically for class 2 device, some class 1 non-exempt devices. And what we're doing with the 510K is that we are finding a predicate device on the market, and we are making a substantial equivalency argument that your subject device is as good or better, substantially equivalent to the device that's already out there in the marketplace. So there is a lot of supporting documentation that needs to be included with a 510K. Typically, clinical data is not necessary for these types of products, but in some cases, it may be necessary. But you have to think about all of the different testing, biocompatibility testing that may need to be done, and whether or not you're going to have sterilization and shelf life issues to deal with. If the product involves software of any type, whether the software is a component or it's the device may be standalone software itself, there's a whole slew of issues that need to be addressed for software alone. So this is why it's very important as we walk through all of these 8 steps to think about these requirements very early on in the product development process as we proceed, because when we get to the point of actually submitting the regulatory application, we will know what to expect and we'll have the information readily available for the submission. Let's talk about the PMA. This is a little more complicated. This is typically for the high-risk class 3 devices. And if any of you have ever put together a PMA before, you understand that these are pretty complex regulatory submissions, and they're quite lengthy. Typically, they consist of multiple volumes of information. Not only are you providing information about the product itself, but you're also including clinical data, different types of studies. You're including a lot of information about your manufacturing process, information about some of your critical suppliers, vendors that may be part of your manufacturing process that are a little more critical to have a good handle around in terms of what they're actually doing from a manufacturing standpoint, which is different than a 510K product where you're not necessarily required to disclose the manufacturing practices that may be performed by a vendor or another type of supplier. So this is a little more comprehensive, and of course it has a longer lead time in terms of review. Let's move on now to a new drug application, a drug submission. This again, a little more complicated. The NDA is the vehicle for drug sponsors to submit a new drug for sale and marketing in the U.S. And essentially, there's a lot of technical information that needs to be included in this submission. And essentially, what you're trying to support is that your drug is safe and effective for its proposed use, that the benefits of the drug outweigh any of the risks, and you want to demonstrate that the methods used in manufacturing the drug and the controls that you have in place to maintain the drug's quality are adequate to preserve the drug's identity, strength, quality, and purity. So this is also quite a complex regulatory submission. Let's talk about the biological license application. This too is quite complex. It has very similar features as a new drug application. Again, you're going to have a lot of technical data, clinical data, microbiology, and this can take a considerable amount of time as well. So as we progress from low to medium to high risk devices, and then when we think about a combination product that includes a variety of different types of combinations that you may have of these medical products, you can see that the regulatory submission, the marketing application or applications that you have to put together can be extremely complex. And in some cases, there will be a lot of overlap, as Steve talked about earlier. But for the most part, you need to consider all of these requirements very early on. And if you don't, it could really delay your project and unfortunately take you off your regulatory pathway or at least postpone it. So you want to think about these things very early on, not only in the product development phase, but throughout this entire process. And that's why it's so critical to update your regulatory strategy at regular intervals, because there will be a lot of bumps in the road. And you're going to have a lot of unexpected issues pop up. And you need to be prepared to immediately execute a plan of action to address and remediate those concerns. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Steve to talk about some of the lessons learned that we'd like to share with you today. Steve?
Steve, you might be muted.
I'm sorry, I just looked down. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Debbie. Thank you. We want to emphasize a couple points because they're really key. These are things that we've witnessed with several clients, so we want to remind everybody. Get your planning in early. The sooner you can get the direction set for the ship that you're sailing on and understand where you're going, the better you can keep it on track. You don't get stuck going down the diversions and rabbit holes. You keep on track. Make sure you have a really comprehensive regulatory strategy. In the case of combination products, as we said, this is the most complex aspect of the different plans that go into the design phase. Excuse me. So by all means, make sure we have a clear, focused regulatory strategy. And then we strongly support early and frequent within reason, communications with the agencies, and the FDA is one we primarily talked about today. Having those discussions facilitates, our understanding of where we should be going, our ability to negotiate changes with the FDA in the future. It helps with all the communications. The better we're all communicating, the better discussions we can have with them. So we really encourage that. Let's take a look at a couple very specific examples that I've run into with a couple clients. One is to think about what does it mean to be cross-functional? Everybody can say that they're cross-functional, but sometimes it's a whole lot harder to embrace it. Do all the cross-functional team members get invited to the meetings? And I'm not talking about marketing and project management, R&D, and quality. Wait a minute. What about all the other guys? The medical affairs, the regulatory affairs, manufacturing, distribution, if you have cold chain distribution coming in, and that's a critical piece. Why, we have to make sure all of these cross-functional team members are aware of the various steps we're taking during the program. So are they all invited? More importantly, if they're all invited, do they all show up? A lot of the big teams, big companies may have plenty of people in product development and quality, for example. But one of the areas that I've consistently found short-staffed is regulatory affairs. And if you expect them to come to all of your meetings and they don't have enough people to spread too thin to attend to everything, how are you going to handle that? So that needs to be addressed with management up front. We need X number of resources from manufacturing, from regulatory, from medical affairs. Whenever we need them, we're going to have them. And then quite often, probably one of the biggest problems I've seen is project managers sometimes decide to save time because the other team members aren't as available. So when it comes time to making the assessments on decisions, well, I've talked to them. I'll just make that call for them. No, if you're going to have a cross-functional team, you really need to make people let people make their own assessments and not shortcut this. So cross-functionality sometimes is a whole lot more difficult than you think. Another trick that has been pretty consistent in terms of saving time and reducing risk has been in working backwards for the product development people. And I'm just going to take one example through this string. If you think about having to have the regulatory submission, and in that I need to have claim substantiation, well, let's work backwards from that. How did I substantiate my claims? I did that through testing in my validation and verification plans. So, but how did I do the V&V plans? Well, they were based upon the outputs from the design. Well, where did the outputs came from inputs? And the inputs came from where? Oh, they came from user needs. So all of a sudden, you find yourself back at the early stages where you're writing down user needs and converting those to input requirements and saying, I need to write those such that I'm able to test them in the V&V stage, and that the V&V testing is going to answer the questions directly so that I can do the claim substantiation for the submission. So in the very early stages where we're talking to customers and physicians, and patients, and everybody else, we should already be thinking about claim substantiation at the end. So work backwards and know where you're driving to, because that can really save you time and confusion going down this path. Debbie, you want to open up for some questions?
A big thanks to Steve and to Lisa before we jump into our next section on Q&A. I'm sure you all will all agree that this was great information and really helps us see some of the tips and tricks to making this work effectively in our organizations. So with that being said, I'd like to share the contact information for our speakers if we don't get a chance to cover all questions today. And I want to go ahead and start with the first question. And we have one submitted to us that says, we're about to plan for our upcoming combination product and wondering how long we should anticipate this process taking for our project plan. I'm wondering, Steve or Lisa, which one of you would like to take this question?
Well, let me take a stab at it. Now, you're going to hate me for doing this because I always hate answers like this. When we start off by saying it depends, and I know that's a lousy answer, but we don't have enough information to answer this. If it's a simple product development project, if it's a simple device or something, especially when I was doing consumer products, we used to get the product development and the submission and 510K approval all done in 6 to 7 months. So it can be done in less than a year easily. If, on the other hand, the device gets a little bit more complicated, it's a 510K of clinicals, or heaven forbid, it's a PMA, well, you could go a year, 2 years, just because of the clinicals. Now what about the drugs? Well, some of the drugs are fairly straightforward, and you might get away with a couple of years between the new clinical testing. Some of them take 3-4 years of clinical trials. And forget about if you're talking about a heart valve or something, that could be multi-years. Then when you're looking at your submissions, if it's straightforward and it's a 510K, you have a lot of the boilerplate, it might only be 3 months. But if it's novel, it's complex, it could easily be 6 months or even longer for the combination products. So I would say, unfortunately, the range is anywhere from maybe 6 months to 5 years plus.
So, Steve, thank you for that thoughtful answer. And I think we all understand that one size can't fit all in today's complex world. We have time for one more question, and I'd like to tee this one up for our speakers. We have somebody who has asked us, why does the strategy document need to be a controlled document? And I'm wondering which one of our speakers might want to handle this question about controlled documents.
Steve, would you like me to take that?
Go ahead. I have some thoughts, but go ahead.
Sure. Well, I think the importance of having a controlled document is necessary to ensure that you're treating it like any other type of control document that you may have in your organization. And because the information that you're including in your regulatory strategy is so critical to the success of the submission and ultimately the launch of your product, you want to have it controlled because you want to look at it at regular intervals, and things are going to change over time. So you don't want to be looking at a document that is not controlled and may not have the most recent up-to-date information as you progress through this process. Steve, what are your thoughts?
I think one of the biggest changes is when we started looking at more of the ISO type style of addressing project planning and project execution. It became critical. You have to know where you're going before you go there. The days of serendipity are gone. Too many mistakes or misses were happening. So it's all about knowing where you're going. And as Lisa just said, if you don't have a version controlled document, you can lose track of where you're going. So it's all about, you have to know where you're going before you go there.
Thanks, guys. I'm looking at and see that we do have some more time, so I'm wondering if our speakers would like to take another one. So we've had a question come up is, can we think of some particular examples of product types that might require more than one submission? Can either of you guys think about that?
Lisa, I'm going to leave that to you.
Sure. So probably the best example would be one that is one of these cross-labeled type of products where, let's say, for example, there is a product out there that is, each constituent part is owned and manufactured by a different company, and they may already be cleared, approved, or licensed for a particular indication for use, and now that constituent is going to be used in a combination product, and it's a different indication for use. Yet that other use of the product is still a viable use of the product, and company A, let's say, for example, still wants to be able to sell that product for that particular use. That would be a situation where multiple marketing applications may be necessary.
Thank you, Lisa. And how about one more here? We have somebody asked us about how would you go about modifying the recommended regulatory path for a 505(b)(2) drug device product. Either of you want to handle that, 505(b)(2) drug device?
The problem with that question, I think it's getting fairly specific, and I don't know that we'd be as comfortable giving a generalized answer to that. That may be one that we best take offline so we could gather a little bit more information. Do you have any general responses to that, Lisa, or would you like to take that offline?
Yeah, I would like to think about that question, because that is a very specific question. We want to be able to provide you with an answer that will be very specific to what you're asking. So I would agree with Steve. We'd like to take that offline, and perhaps the individual who asked that question could reach out to either Steve or myself directly, and we can talk through that with you.
But that's a great segue, because we are going to answer all of the questions that have been typed. We can't get them all in the time frame, but we'll be receiving the rest of these questions from Debbie as the moderator, and we will be answering and getting back in touch with you all.
So that sounds like a great place to land on a really excellent webinar today. So I wanted to thank everybody for participating in today's webinar.